Today's Moravian reading is Luke 23 verse 13 to 31. We are continuing to reflect on the events that led up to Jesus' crucifixion and death. Now, Pilate has found no basis for charge against Jesus. He wants Jesus to be freed, albeit after being flogged severely. So I think for Pilate, probably based on the popularity of Jesus, the reputation of Jesus with the crowds, he puts the decision out to the people, as opposed to thinking, well, the crowds love him, so that they will ask for his release. It's just yet another step in the madness of this whole trial. The Jewish leaders, they pass him to Pilate, Pilate passes him to Herod, Herod back to Pilate, and now Pilate puts the decision, passes it to the crowds. No one wants the blame to land on them, really, I think. And the crowds now, perhaps unexpectedly, turn on Jesus. They start to shout out for his crucifixion. Only earlier they were shouting, "Hosanna, save us." We can only assume that the religious leaders had orchestrated this and rented the crowd. And Pilate has to go with the crowd. He wants to avoid a riot in Jerusalem at this time. And for me, I think this reading, it just reminds me of the difference between the historical and the theological. Historically, who is responsible for Jesus' death? The Jewish leaders? Herod? Pilate? The people? Well, yes to all of them. But theologically, doctrinally, who is responsible? On one level, it's us, it's me, it's you and I. It was our sin that led him to the cross. But at an even deeper level, who is responsible? Jesus. He's giving his life willingly as an offering for our sin. His love led him to the cross. And I think we see something of that truth echoed in the story of Barnabus, the guilty one set free in place of the innocent one, Jesus, a divine exchange taking place. Jesus, the innocent one, is punished in Barabbas' place. He dies on his behalf. It's the gospel, isn't it? The same is true for each one of us. We are Barabbas in this story. And I always wonder what the impact would have been on Barabbas' life. And then our reading moves on to Simon from Cyrene, modern day Libya, a pilgrim in Jerusalem. Again, someone who gets caught up in this story, forced to carry the crossbar to Golgotha, the place of crucifixion. Now, I unpacked something about Simon in more detail back in Mark 15. But here's a devout Jew bringing a Passover lamb, his Passover lamb, into the city to be sacrificed as the Passover lamb is led out of the city to become our sacrifice for sin. And we know from Romans 16 that the impact of this event on Simon, on his sons, one of his sons goes on to be a leader in the early church. Such was the impact of this encounter. And then finally in our reading, the weeping daughters of Jerusalem, the women disciples who followed Jesus to the cross, so concerned for Jesus, so painfully aware of his fate of crucifixion that they mourned and wailed. And Jesus turns this around too, doesn't he? He says, "Don't weep for me, weep for your children, for yourselves." Jesus is aware of how in a relatively short period of time, 40 years or so, the Romans will have totally destroyed Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's daughters will indeed have been put to the sword or had to flee to the hills, as was the prophecies. You see, an encounter with Jesus always leads to transformation. Even in this incredible moment in Jesus' life of trial, of punishment, and let's remember, Luke doesn't mention it explicitly, but we know between verse 25 and verse 26 from the other records and history, Jesus would have been flogged, scourged, experienced significant blood loss and pain and shock. And yet at this point, the course of Barabbas's history is changed forever. The course of Simon's history is changed forever. These women are prophetically forewarned and forearmed for what is about to come. Their lives are changed. An encounter with Jesus always leads to transformation. And we've been invited into that too, haven't we? And so I just think it's worth pausing again, once again today, just to thank him for his work on the cross and the way that has changed our lives forever. Amen.